think the point you made about Florida sort of having this 100% privatized system, this was kind of the first thing that got me interested, was sort of the idea of the state essentially handing over this pretty crucial function, I think, of sort of the goal of rehabilitating youth, I think, preventing them from becoming criminals, to private companies, and in a lot of cases for-profit companies. And so I was kind of curious who the major players were out there, and started looking around, and I realized that this company, Youth Services International, has sort of existed in under various different names for the last 25 years, but basically the pattern of behavior has been pretty consistent, that it's sort of a lot of contract violations, a lot of allegations of abuse, and typically whenever there have been problems through the years, the company will sort of, in some cases it's pulled out of contracts as the state was sort of starting to amass evidence that there were some really serious problems, or the contracts will end and the state will say, oh, we're not going to renew this anymore. So it's been interesting that there really hasn't been there have been a lot of cases where the state has actually terminated their contract, and then that kind of goes on your record, and when you're applying for new contracts, then that comes up in sort of your history. So it's been interesting to see sort of how a company like this, despite the problems that, I brought up and that you just noted now, a lot of these things don't often come up in the contract review process or when they're applying to get new contracts. And so this was kind of really what interested me about the story.
Can you talk about James Slattery's role in running Youth Services International? How did he start?
So, yeah, he has a pretty interesting history. He initially was actually in the hotel business in New York City, and he was worked in the Sheraton Hotel Corporation, ran some hotels around New York City, and at the time he got involved with a few other business partners, and they had owned and managed a few hotels around the city. And at this time, this was kind of in the 80s in New York City, crime was extremely high, property values were going down, and a lot of property owners realized that they could get a lot more money from sort of housing, essentially homeless people, welfare. They could get a lot more welfare money from the government than they could actual market rates.
At these places called welfare hotels.
Welfare hotels, exactly. And so what ended up happening was this really kind of destroyed a lot of neighborhoods, because a lot of sort of investors came in, they sort of flooded these buildings with people who probably should have been in treatment, but instead they were just kind of warehoused in these facilities. So this was kind of the first way in terms of kind of building a business off of government money. And from the city started shutting these down because they realized that there were tons of code violations. In one of these hotels, some children died in a fire after they were just sort of left alone. So pretty bad conditions in these hotels. So next, they sort of had these properties, and at this time it was kind of Reagan was pushing a lot in terms of privatization of a lot of government services, and so federal prisons became kind of the next concept for privatization. And so a lot of these hotels, there was a possibility of using them for halfway houses. So basically federal prisoners getting out, that this would be sort of transitional housing for them. And so that was kind of how we first got into the federal contracting game. And from there, what's been interesting is that I sort of discovered once you get into this business, it's really hard to get out. There's not a lot of barriers to entry seemingly, but a lot of companies don't want to get into this business. So it's kind of the same few actors that sort of handle a lot of these private prison contracts. And so in this case, they were able to get the federal halfway house contracts. There were a lot of problems with those early on, some really poor conditions that were found in these buildings. I think one of the inspection reports I saw claimed that there was only enough food for maybe half of the inmates. Whoever got there first got fed, and then the rest were sort of left to their own devices. So despite this, the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service at that time, they were starting to look to privatize some of their facilities for detainees. So really he just started getting contract after contract, and kind of the rest is history. since then, he sort of moved into the juvenile business. He started doing a lot of adult prisons around the country, and then in 2005, he sold off a lot of his assets to another big private prison company called the Geo Group, which is still in existence today.
Formerly Wackenhut.
Exactly, formerly Wackenhut. And then he bought back the youth division for his own company. So now he's been sort of mostly in the juvenile private corrections business.
One of the arguments in favor of privatization, which you also mention in your report, is that private prisons or detention facilities are able to provide better services at lower cost. What is it that you found, and how do these conditions, for example, what you just said, that there was food often only for half the inmates, so how do these private facilities compare with public facilities of a comparable kind? Well,
I think that's really the difficult question. I mean, I think the claim, of course, by the industry is that they can offer these services at a much lower cost. But really, there have been no studies that have not been financed by the industry that have proven that. So it's a difficult claim because you're sort of having to say, what is the exact same service that's being provided by the public, the public corrections department or the public juvenile justice department and this private operator? Are they the exact same kind of inmates? Do they have the exact same sort of needs in terms of services for health or for therapy? And so it's difficult to make those comparisons. And then in these cases, I think when oversight is not as strong as it can be, I think companies are only going to be incentivized to do what the government that's paying them makes them do. And so in these cases, if the oversight is lacking, if there's not constant monitoring, I think there is an incentive to sort of cut costs and services.
So tell us what you found in Florida. 100% of the juvenile facilities are for-profit.
100% are privatized. There's a mix of nonprofit and for-profit providers in Florida.
And so what did you find in these facilities? What was happening to the kids?
Right. So basically, I mean, there was sort of consistent accounts of physical abuse from guards. So this was basically, I mean, you had a lot of guards who were getting paid very little.
What's the age range of the children in these facilities?
It's like 13 to 18 or so. So we're talking about teenagers, essentially, boys and girls in these facilities. Not mixed. I mean, there's different facilities for each. So the guards often resorted to violence as sort of the first means of just dealing with the situation, and these are obviously troubled kids. That's the reason they're in these facilities in the first place. But a lot of times you sort of discovered that the guards were often the same, knew the kids from the neighborhood, perhaps had gotten in trouble with the kids before. They already had relationships with the kids. The guards, this is not the highest caliber of staff. So a lot of times you had sort of gang affiliations, rivalries between guards and youth within the facilities, which caused a lot of problems. In one case in a facility in Broward County, Florida, which is just north of Miami, there was a boy who claimed that he had been forced to perform oral sex on one of the guards. He told the authorities this 3 times, and only the 3rd time, 10 months later, did they finally report it to the police. So the other thing was that a lot of incidents that were documented, there was evidence, and a lot of former employees told me that that was only a fraction of what was actually happening.
In the piece that came out today in the Huffington Post, you go back to an example in 2004 when Youth Services International was confronted with a potentially expensive situation. They were 3 months into a $10 million contract to run Thompson Academy, a juvenile prison in the state of Florida. And already the facility had become a scene of documented violence and neglect. What happened next?
So in this case, this is the story that we'll publish today. There was a contract monitor from the state. So generally the way these private businesses work is that you run the facility, but someone's coming in to inspect you every once in a while. So this was the inspector coming in and basically documenting a lot of problems, a complete breakdown in organization. A lot of staff were getting fired for essentially breaking youths' arms, for slamming them to the floor. There were escapes. So in this case, the monitor was really coming down hard on the company. And was saying we need to do a lot more reviews. We need to basically threatening them to reduce the number of kids that could come to the facility, potentially reducing the amount of money in their contract. And at one point, the monitor actually sent an email. This guy's name was Jerry Blanton. He sent an email to his bosses saying, "I recommend that this facility be closed." And at that same time, the company went back to the state and basically went around the monitor and said, "This guy is out of control. He's out of line. He's coming in here doing unannounced inspections. We have some serious issues with this guy." And then 2 months later, the state fired that monitor. And despite this guy getting fired and sort of blowing the whistle, the state came back a few months later and in its annual audit of the facility essentially confirmed all the findings that this monitor had. But from then on, there were a number of the facility had a number of problems in future audits, but they managed to continue to retain this contract until just last year, when the state didn't actually cancel it. They just said, "We're reducing the size of our facilities, and so we're not going to renew this one." But then they handed them 3 new contracts this year.